Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the podcast from the Event Management Journal. My name's James Cannell and I'm here with my co-host Alan File. Hi, Alan.
Yeah, morning, James, and hi, Laura. Nice to meet you.
Morning.
Hi, Laura. We're really pleased you could be with us to talk about your paper today. Laura Misener has written this paper that's just come out in Event Management with her co-authors Landy Liu, Ran Zhao and Gangzhao Chen. It's called Examining the Evolution of Network Governance Forms of an Event Leveraging Collective, a Longitudinal Investigation. So thank you very much for giving us your time today.
No problem. Happy to hang out with you.
I wonder if you could just start things off for our viewers and listeners by telling us a little bit about you and who you are, maybe what you're working on at the moment. Just give us a bit of an introduction.
Great. Sounds good. So Laura Misener, I'm a professor at Western University. So that's in London, Ontario. It's in the School of Kinesiology here. And we have a small sport management program. Also, the International Center for Olympic Studies is here at Western. So I'm a member of that center. And so that really is a help and spurs on a lot of the work that we do around events. And so I'm fortunate to be part of that center. And so that's also where I've gotten some of my good students, and one of my co-authors, Landy Liu, who actually was one of my postdocs who came and worked with me for a year and a half before she went on to her position at Minnesota. So it's a great place to be right now.
Because you have it's an international co-author team, which is great.
Yes. I know. I mean, I could talk about why that co-author team too.
Why is it so international?
Well, certainly because this is a longitudinal study, and I've been working with this group since 2014 around games, particularly these games, which was the Para-Pan American Games. And I know because I was involved with this, what now is called the Leveraging Group, a legacy group at the time when they originally formed. And they asked me originally to come on and be an advisor as they kind of started things. And I helped with redefining where they wanted to go post games and sort of that piece. So for me, then as I started to have, I collected all this data and I had all this going for many years. And when Landy came to work with me, the great piece was having this new fresh set of eyes to look at the data and start to ask really different questions. And she brought in that really interesting lens of understanding how the collective worked, what that looked like. And then she has a real strong background in institutional theory. And so we started to look at that from this kind of nuanced perspective, where most of my work previously had been drawing primarily just on the leveraging perspective. So she brought in the institutional piece. And as we looked further at the data, we thought, how else could we look at this? And that's where Guangzhou and Ran came in and helped us with the network piece, because we also then wanted to understand more, how does a group like this, as they started out as part of an event, they thought, it happens, we know that, in the event space, we're hosting a big event, we want to have some sort of impact. And so groups come together and they form this, whatever it looks like, an organization, in our case, sort of a collective, and evolved over time. But this group is quite unique in the fact that they really chose to stay together over time and through many different iterations. And so we needed a different way to look at that. So that was really neat to have Ran and Guangzhou come in from a very different perspective and say, hey, these are the kinds of questions we should be asking, because how come this group has decided to stay together, unlike we've seen in many locations, London, Vancouver, where the only way that group stayed together is they formed a formalized organization, whereas this has really remained a very informal group of organizations, and very small, very underfunded, most of them nonprofit organizations that somehow are working together to make this really big impact. So it's kind of an interesting. So that's where the international group of us came together, and they could ask really interesting questions, even of me, that I hadn't really thought of before, because I was so embedded in the processes.
I think that's a real strength of having this longitudinal approach, isn't it? So you can go back into something you've been, like you say, you've been thinking about this for say a decade or so,
right
in there, but somebody coming fresh to it and being able to look back at this data that you've got is amazing, really.
Yeah, and when you're embedded in it,
illustration, isn't it, Laura? Because it's not it. My sort of PhD was sort of related, so I found this study really interesting. Brought back some memories, but it's quite unusual to have an informal group behave like this.
Yes. Yeah, it was. And I mean, I think when they first came together around the event, there was sort of a strategic imperative from one really, strong organization that like, we need to do something. This is really an opportunity for these small organizations that focus on disability and disability sport to actually work together. And, the irony is we have this assumption, particularly in the community sport space, and in Canada and our provincial sport organizations, that they're all, similar missions. Obviously, they must work together. They must, collect and talk and collaborate and do these things. But the reality is they actually don't. And that's one of the main problems, is that they feel like they're in competition all the time. And so therefore they can't work together. So the event creates a catalyst for them to come together around a centralized objective. And so that was what is so unique. And for these organizations that, as I mentioned, are really underfunded for the most part, are marginal in the sports space because they focus on disability sport, and there's all kinds of challenges with that. So this was this really unique piece to be able to come together early on, but then for them to actually say, we want to actually stay together, working together over the longer term, which was very different than I've seen before.
And you say they feel like they're competing with each other. Are they actually competing with each other sometimes for small pots of funding, for grants and things? Are they actually in a more combative policy space than we realized?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we wrote about that in one of the earlier papers, about the fact that there was these sort of competing logic in how they went about things, but then they were actually competing for the same resources. The irony, of course, being that if they actually worked together to go after those resources, the likelihood of success was much better. But that takes a lot of time and effort to kind of figure that out, to recognize if we collectively work on these projects, we'll have much greater impact. But, when you're in your office and you're working in your own space and you get your note that says, hey, there's this grant opportunity from the provincial government, you're going to go after it. You're not going to think to reach out to 10 other organizations, right? Yeah. So that's really what they were. So they were competing, and they still are in many respects, but they're doing it in a much more informed way as well, recognizing that, this is probably better for you guys to work on. We'll work on this piece. We'll work together on these pieces. So that's something that's really changed over time.
What would you say the key learning messages from your study, Laura? What are the things that really stand out as, the really key lessons for people to pick up on this? Because, it's a really interesting area, and it's quite an unusual slide you've taken. What do you really push from it?
Yeah, it's fun. I would say the leadership piece is the big one, right? There's the questions around, if we look back to the early days of when this group got together, there was clearly a centralized leader who I think at the time thought that organization was going to step away from things early on in the process and let these organizations collectively work together. But that didn't really pan out the way they thought it would, right? And I think, we always have these assumptions, which is great, this gets people together, these organizations, and let them go on their way and do their thing. But it took a long time and many iterations of working together to find the right type of leadership to work together. And so ultimately, what they found was this collective leadership. So in this case, it's pillar-based, what they've called pillar-based. So it's specifically different strategies. So 4 different strategic areas, and creating the opportunity for different people and organizations to take leadership roles within each of those pillars. Because then there was a sense of ownership and the sense of accomplishment in doing things within each of those pillars. When it was one centralized leader, an organization that was leading, it really was easy for organizations to step back and not take on that role and that responsibility. And so that, then that's not something that happened, right after the games. That's something that evolved over time, 4, 5, 6 years out, after many iterations, lots of discussions, lots of working together to find the right role and responsibilities for the leadership group and how that would work.
So what are they doing in the different pillars?
Yeah.
Could you maybe just give us a sense of like what's each pillar trying to achieve? Because you talked about leveraging, and I think it's really, really rare, I think, for a concept that we're talking about as academics to also being used by policy people and being implemented. That's actually happening.
Yeah.
What are they doing for this leveraging? What do each of these pillars do?
It's so interesting because when I first started working with this group back in 2013, I was taken aback that they had started to use the language of leveraging. So and it wasn't me that brought it to them because, as you say, normally James, you're the academic who walks in and uses this language and people are like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
But they really recognized that they were outside the formal processes of running the event. And that sort of organizing committee is typically where we see sort of the legacy processes happening. And they recognize that coming together, they could capitalize on these different opportunities of the event coming. And what could that look like? And I remember one of my early conversations, and I wrote about it in the paper and our book that we've published from some of this early work is, the first meeting I went to with them, and they were talking about how this event in the Greater Toronto area, so it's a big area. There was 14 municipalities involved, was going to impact sport participation across the entire province of Ontario. Now, James, that's like saying, an event in London is going to impact, sport participation in the northwest of Scotland, in one of the outer isles. Like that's, it's not realistic.
And we had a big event in London 10 years ago. That was 12 years ago. They really did say it was going to increase sports participation in the north of Scotland.
Think it is.
It
jury's out.
Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't. It didn't. There was a lot of conversation then about like paring down the goals to be realistic about what could we impact, what would be realistic to capitalize on coming out of it. And so then over time, those strategies that they developed early on have sort of become the pillars of how they function. So they're using the early leveraging strategies, the goals, to continue on with those pillars. So one of those is in education, for example. And in the education sector, we know that kids are not exposed to parasport in the schools very much. There's not a lot of education in educational opportunities in universities around parasport. And so that pillar is continuing the work around educational opportunities, working with specific types of organization that works with the school systems in order to create new opportunities for understanding, awareness, getting equipment, all those pieces that come with the education piece. So each of the pillars still continues that piece. And recently, they've actually even reached back out to some of the funding opportunities that remain from those games to get more equipment for schools to use. So they're still kind of capitalizing on those previous connections and previous opportunities that they had. And then there's other areas, things like coaching and leadership, right? We know we need more parasport coaches. Every game that's a parasport event talks about sport participation and more coaches. How do you do it? This pillar was really focused on how you do that, and has made some really, really big strides in that particular piece. Classification as well. That's a whole muddy area that they're still trying to work out as well. So each of those pillars sort of has a specific strategic area that they're working on that is built on the momentum from the games.
And then they talk to each other. You've got the diagram in your paper of the sort of changing structure from having one sort of central node that everything's going through to something that's more, I don't know, circular almost in shape.
Right.
And is everybody talking to everybody else, or is it very issue based?
So what happens is that there is opportunities within the pillars, so lots of communication there, and the network piece really showed that there is that's good communication, but there still remains some challenges with the overall network. We know that there's sort of still some centralized actors that are playing really strong roles in driving it forward. Not surprising, those leaders, but then there are others that are on the periphery that are not as involved in that network and communicating in the same way. And I think that's something that they're working on as they move forward. And interestingly, we've been able to feed back the findings from our study. Landy and I have continued to work with them and say, these are the things that we found, particularly the network piece. They were quite interested because the assumption is, yeah, sure, everybody's connected. And then when you do that and we show them, then they go, oh, here's where some of the gaps are and some of the misalignments in the communication. And so there's been then a lot of effort in the past few months of how do we then, fix some of those gaps. What can we do moving forward? And what are we going to do moving forward? So it's a really interesting piece on how they're actually learning from the work that we've been doing as well.
It's amazing how many people think they are connected until you start digging deeper. So
Yeah.
at a superficial level, everybody's connected, but the reality is very, very different.
Right. Right. And this was the interesting thing about having, Landy and my co-authors come in and do the interview. And Landy did a lot of the interviews for the piece. And having her being removed from it, she would ask some of those questions that, I took for granted sometimes. And we know that. I mean, Alan, you've done this kind of work before, ethnographic work. Sometimes you don't see it because you become embedded. And so having her do those interviews and ask the questions was really interesting and telling, because she would get at things that I hadn't thought to get at, because I was, in it, and I understood the context of it. And so that was really enlightening. And that showed us more about where there were some challenges in those connections and the network than what they assume. They have this nice, really nice setup, these great pillars, and everybody communicates and talks to one another at our big meetings. But there still remains some challenges with that. And of course, over time, there's different people and different actors that come into play. So that also changes things.
And how did they how was it received? You said, I mean, it's fantastic, this sort of closing the loop of going back to and saying, look, this is what we found. How did people respond to that sort of emotionally? Was it well received? Is it coming in and saying, this is who you are?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in some respects there's been mixed reaction, because I think there's some people who thought, like, this is the best, and we are saying this is a great thing, but then some people react negatively when you tell them, well, it's not working as well as you think it is. So that made me up. So it's about how we communicate. We've been very careful about the way we communicate that, and talking about, here's how you could improve. And embedded in our piece are some of those things about, here's what you need to think about in terms of sustainability of those roles and responsibilities, and how are you going to train people to become leaders of each of those pillars, and take on that responsibility, so it's just not off the side of their desk. So that's been, it's been tricky. It's been received well, but certainly there's some pushback of, because they know best, right?
Yeah.
For people in their roles. Yeah. Always know best. So we're really careful about how we communicate that information to them. I've been fortunate to continue to be invited to their larger forums, and they recently held a forum that was sort of a culmination of their major granting project. They were successful in getting a $3 million grant from the provincial government to do their work. And so culmination of that grant was they had to feed back the outcomes. And so I presented at that forum, and that was very well received. And so now people are coming back and going, okay, so how do we get more money? So, which is also a concern. And we point that out in the paper, is that it can't be, the finances and funding of it can't be the driver, right? We talk about the various drivers of this. If the funding alone is the driver of it, it's not going to be sustainable. It didn't start on a funding-based approach. It started as a catalyst from the event with no funding. So they got funding, and our worry is, when the funding is gone, if that's become the centralized driver, will that mean that won't be sustainable? And so it is an interesting dilemma for this type of collective. And actually, there's some cases in the UK where we've seen that happen, where there's been funding come from UK Sport, for example, that has really driven an initiative forward. But as soon as the funding is gone, those initiatives, they cease to exist. Right?
It's amazing how the funding is a good thing in the short term, but it actually can pollute the dynamic of these relationships. Because you see it time and time again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly sort of the worry. And that's one of the things that we wanted to look at with this piece is, what are the drivers for individuals and organizations to be there? And while it's telling that there's a lot more than the funding, there is funding is still a big piece of it. And so we'll see what happens moving forward.
Good. To some, was that a surprise finding for you, Laura, or were there other things that came out that you think, gee, we didn't expect that to be so prevalent in the outcomes from this study?
That I don't know that one was necessarily all that surprising. The funny thing is that what's interesting about that finding is the fact that there are actually many in that network who don't even really know about the funding. Like, they know there's some money available, and they know they can they can apply for it as part of this collective, but that's not really what they're there for. They were there so much more for the connection to other organizations. Like, how do you do this? How do you work on these? How do you apply for these particular grants? So for me, I think that's still surprising, because we still see people in organizations joining this group and trying to be part of this collective because they want to be part of that knowledge hub. And I think that's the piece that's really continuing to surprise me as coming out of it, is that there is such a willingness to work with one another on these different pieces. And I hesitate because I don't know whether that's unique to the disability sports sector, where resources are very scarce and where there's often, those organizations are marginal. So I don't know whether that's unique here, or if we haven't really seen other cases like this. So that's the thing. This is quite an interesting one, because I think these organizations are just trying to do good things and make things happen for disability sport, whether it's recreational all the way up to elite level. And so trying to find ways to do that, they do need others in order to support them to do that. So that's probably the biggest finding, is the piece around the desire for that connection and knowledge and working together. And that's been such a huge benefit for all those organizations.
So where do you go next with this? So as you're talking, I can sort of feel ideas falling out of it all. As you're talking, there's so many different dimensions to what you're talking about. Are there other organisations like this? Is this the same in other sectors? Where are you going to go next with this sort of network governance approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd be really interested to see how it. We have done a little bit of how it maps on in other sectors, and that's where our theory, Proven's theory, comes from is other sectors, which is great. What I think I'm keenly interested in, because of the event piece, is how much the event remains a catalyst for this type of group to come together. And in the face of no event, what happens? Right. And I fear, I would say, that this group is an interesting example of, they may have run their course, and without something else to catalyze them, they may not continue. And so that's something I'm quite interested in, is how do we then use events as these catalytic factors in order to support organizations to come together and create these opportunities to do the work they want to do. Because we know in a sport environment where resources are scarce and the opportunity to connect is often quite limited, because we're all so busy and these organizations are just running around getting their own thing done, an event can create this catalytic opportunity. So it might be another way we actually use and capitalize events, whether they be small scale or large scale. I'm really interested in how can we use those events even more to the advantage of small communities who may not have those resources, but might be able to create these collectives and organizations, and then lobby for more resources, lobby governments, work together in a more effective way. So I think that governance piece really is critical, because what you see is they come together, they don't actually have a way to work together. They just kind of, and then they flounder and then they fail. Whereas I think with the governance piece, we can really support those organizations to create solid governance mechanisms that will help support them over the longer term to be more effective. So I'm really interested in that kind of work.
Yeah, and I think just listening to you talk is this longer term perspective, and you've done this longitudinal study. I wonder if there's something in all this about the kind of maturity of events as a research area. Now we've not just us, but our institutions, our journals have been around long enough to mean that, okay, we're building up a longer time period in our knowledge here. You can look at, we've been talking about legacy for a long time. Actually, we're now seeing through legacies of these events, and so I wonder if there's something about the maturity of the subject area means we might start to get this more sort of more complex knowledge about the implementation of legacy and these things.
Agreed. And because we, I think if you look back to some of the early event works, there was always calls for more longitudinal work. But the space was so young, there wasn't a lot of that work being done. And so now we're seeing more of that work being done. And I think that's something that says something about the field, where we're going with it, but then also about the types of questions we can be asking, because we can then use that longitudinal data in very different ways and understand more about what happens, not just in the short time frame of when an event occurs, but that pre and post piece becomes so much more relevant, and particularly the post, because I think a lot of the early events works looked at, we talk about post event, we talk about the 6 months, and then when the OC's gone, that's
it's a very small post, isn't it?
Right. And yet for the city that hosts it, or the country, or it's not done then, right? You go in London and you still see things talked about. You go in Vancouver and you still, there's all kinds of relevance, and how those are used in different ways might say something about the value for cities who are not wanting to host and not wanting to put the resources in and not wanting to do all this stuff. And, and maybe there's different arguments that can be made about why or why not cities might want to host large or small scale events, if there is something more they can attach to and say, these are the relevant issues, right? So, yeah.
It's so difficult in many ways, because if you take London, you mentioned London, the other London, there's still things happening now that you can relate back to the Olympics back in 2012. And that's like 12 years ago.
Oh goodness! I went. My youngest daughter had her first gymnastics competition. Very exciting. And in this sports hall out on sports hall, it's a leisure centre with a big sports facility in it, out on the sort of northeast corner of London. Inside the arena they were in was a huge London 2012 banner. And it was very nostalgic to see this kind of Olympic thing there. And clearly, we're talking about legacy. That is still having a felt effect. And they talked about it, and it gave the kids a little bit of a lift. And it was quite, even though 7-year-olds, it's prehistory for them. But there is that long-term thing in cities. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing is, you don't like the big events have them really branded in that way. But there's also other things that happen as a result, but people don't really think about. And interestingly, we were just in Vancouver with my family, and we were just walking by, and I said, that park is part of the legacy program from the 2010 games, because it's an accessible park, and you don't see it. There's a little tiny logo that, if you look closely, from the organization Lift Philanthropy, which is what Legacies now became. They fund community-based projects that are about accessibility and inclusion. And so that's one of the projects that they fund. And so again, they're not always these big flashy branded things either. There are other things that are happening, and I think it would be fascinating. That would be a huge study, but really to go back and look at these broader, longer term legacies and impacts that have actually come from events. And then sometimes they're difficult to assess, but I think there's things that we can say, wow, that came about because this. Would it have come about otherwise? I don't know, maybe not. But these are the things that happen.
It's really hard connecting all the dots to provide the evidence that there is a direct legacy, though, isn't it? Because there's so many different pieces at play. And
I think, I should say that one of the things that we do talk about in this paper and the previous papers that talk about this particular case is that there is a strong policy imperative in the province of Ontario that helps support this. In Ontario, we have the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which has to be all public service organizations, including educational institutions, have to be fully accessible by 2025. I laugh at that every time I say it, because it's never going to happen. However, what the 2014 games did, and this group has done, is use the fact that this is a policy imperative in order to drive the rationale for why they need funding, why they should be working together, what their organizations need to be doing. And so for them, that was a really big piece. So I think looking forward, when you look at other types of events and other types of organizations to come together, a critical piece that needs to be understood is the policy environment within which they exist. Because if there isn't the supportive policy environment, then chances are they're not going to be successful, right? Hence London. That's a prime example of it, right? Policy environment changes, suddenly sport participation doesn't matter, inclusion doesn't matter, right? So Yeah, so that critical interconnection of the policy environment with the event space is such an important part of the success of this case, and I would really like to look at that even more because I like the policy piece as well.
So, Laura, you've got great experience. You've done a good study here. You've done many other good studies. What would your advice be to a new researcher in the field? So, someone just coming in. What advice would you give them in terms as a sort of career liftoff to get them?
Right. I'm always talking to my students about choosing the areas of research and the things that they do that they have a passion for. We often get steered away because there's funding in this space or somebody's done some cool things in this space. But is that what's going to drive you and make you have that fire to want to continue this? I think about the fact that I wouldn't be continuing to work with these groups and with them for 10 plus years if I wasn't really passionate about it. And coming into the space around disability sport was, post PhD. I did that later, but I really found the event space during my PhD, and I did my work on urban regimes. And wow, I guess I had no idea how much I loved the event space until I started working in it. And then now it's particularly the parasport and disability sport space. So, really be thoughtful and mindful about the fact that this is your career, and it's okay to choose things that you're really passionate about, that you can see there being an opportunity to make change in. That's something for me that I think is really critical in any of the young researchers that I talk to. Don't go after space because it looks good out there and on paper. How are you going to really be passionate about that?
Yeah. And you know what, Laura, it's interesting. I go back many years. That's the advice I got 30 plus years ago. Yeah. And I've always stuck by it, but I think it's harder for the younger generation because metrics and that were not an issue really in the 1990s. They existed, but it didn't really matter. There's such the temptation to jump on the metrics bandwagon that it's actually quite hard to stick to your real passions. I think it's slightly harder now.
I agree. It's definitely harder because there is such pressures in the academic environment. I mean, I'm a director of our school, and so I see it with my young colleagues coming in and in the hiring practices that we're doing now. It is very challenging, but I still think there's ways to intertwine sort of the needs of the academic environment, that pressures, with what you really can see happening and being able to move that forward.
Yeah, that's that kind of magic spot, isn't it? If you can do what you love and be recognized for it, then I think it's what we all want.
And it's not always going to come right away, right? Like that's the other thing I'm finding with some of our young scholars coming in is that the expectation that all of this is going to happen overnight, right? They're gonna just like publish a study and that's it. Their name is known and they're out there.
Set.
No, it doesn't work that way. In publishing studies, sometimes they're going to be terrible, sometimes they're going to be great, and it's okay. You have to go through all these iterations, and it does take time. And patience is more of a virtue now than ever, right? Like it is okay to take the time.
So we've got our last question. We like to ask everybody.
Okay.
It's our favorite question. What should people have on their bookshelf? If you were going to be recommending something to somebody to read who's maybe interested in your field or anything at all, really, could be from the journal, could be some. What do you think people should be reading at the moment? Is there anything you'd recommend?
Oh gosh, that's a tricky one. There is some really good stuff out there right now, right? Like, I think that. I've worked with Lawrence Chalop and Christine Green for a long time, good colleagues of mine, and some of the early work that Lawrence did around social leveraging is such a critical piece. And then, of course, there's been many iterations of that. But what I would then suggest to do is go back to where those came from, because those ideas around, spaces of liminality and understanding liminal spaces is such a critical part in events that we don't think enough about. And so that's the kind of works I would be looking at. And I'm still a proponent of going back to some of our foundational theories in terms of that. And I've used Bourdieu and I've used social capital and those kinds of things in the event space. And I still think those are really critical to have on your shelf to pull from. But then more recently, I have some PhD students who actually are pushing me in the boundaries of our thinking around decolonizing the theories that we're looking at. And so some of our newer scholars, or scholars that are non-Western scholars, in kind of bringing that into that space. And we've been looking at, with one of my students, the concept of Ubuntu understanding. So caring and thinking about how that fits in with these liminal spaces, and what do we understand around the event space, and can we change that? So I think some of those different theoretical readings are necessary to have at your hand, so that you can go and start to think and push the field in a little bit new and different direction, that sometimes it needs that push.
Great recommendations. I'm looking forward to looking up some of those ideas. We'll put links to some of this stuff in the show notes, so that people, if they're interested in this, there'll be things they can click on and go and have a look at. So thanks for sharing that with us, and thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Happened to spend some time with you.
Thank you.
I think your last point there, it's so important, because I think we've all grown up in a sort of Western dominance of this stuff.
Yes.
But actually, there's a whole world out there that we haven't ignored, but we've not really taken as much care and attention as perhaps we should have done. And it's really, the more diverse student mix we get now, it really does throw this in your life. They don't see it like this at all. So no, I appreciate what you've said. Yeah.
Hey. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to our listeners and viewers. That's the end of the show, and we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thanks, Laura.
Thanks.
Excellent.
Bye, Alan.
Interesting.